The red roses arrived every October 15th at exactly 6:47 a.m., placed carefully on the front porch of 412 Maple Street in the small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, where nobody locked their doors and the biggest scandal usually involved the church bake sale committee, but for 20 years these crimson flowers appeared like clockwork, accompanied by a handwritten note that simply read, "For Emma, never forgotten." And what the entire town didn't know was that these roses would finally reveal the truth about what happened to Emma Catherine Walsh, the beloved third-grade teacher who vanished without a trace on October 5th, leaving behind a classroom full of children who still asked their parents why Miss Emma never came back. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. The person delivering those roses had been walking past the police station every single morning for 2 decades, nodding to the same officers who had spent years searching for Emma's killer, and nobody suspected that the answer to Millfield's greatest mystery was hiding in plain sight, waiting for modern DNA technology to finally unmask a secret that had been carefully buried for 20 years. If you think you know how this ends, you're probably wrong, because what investigators discovered when they finally tested those rose petals would shake this quiet Pennsylvania town to its core and reveal that some secrets can only stay buried for so long. Emma Catherine Walsh had been Millfield's golden girl since the day she was born on a snowy February morning, and the kind of child who made adults believe in the inherent goodness of humanity with her infectious laugh and genuine concern for every living creature she encountered. By the time she graduated from Millfield High School as valedictorian, and Emma had already decided to dedicate her life to education, specifically working with young children who needed someone to believe in their potential the way her own third-grade teacher, Mrs. Helen Morris, had believed in hers. The decision to return to Millfield after completing her education degree at Penn State wasn't difficult for Emma, who had always felt that home was where she could make the most difference. She was hired as a third-grade teacher at Millfield Elementary School, the same institution where she had learned to read and discovered her love of learning. The principal, Robert Fisher, would later tell investigators that Emma was the kind of teacher who arrived early and stayed late, not because she had to, but because she genuinely loved what she did. Emma's classroom was a wonderland of color and creativity, with student artwork covering every available wall space and reading corners filled with bean bags and stuffed animals that she had purchased with her own money. Her students adored her, and parents regularly requested that their children be placed in Miss Walsh's class, knowing that she would not only teach them academic skills but also instill in them a love of learning that would last a lifetime. She had a special gift for reaching struggling students, often staying after school to provide extra help and encouragement to children who had begun to believe they weren't smart enough to succeed. The young teacher lived alone in a small but charming apartment above Miller's Bakery on Main Street, a cozy space that she had decorated with plants and photographs of her students and family. Emma was close to her parents, David and Margaret Walsh, who lived just 3 blocks away and worried constantly about their daughter living alone. Though they tried not to be overprotective, she had never married, though she had dated several local men over the years, including Michael Brennan, the high school football coach, and Dr. James Patterson, the town's veterinarian, but none of these relationships had developed into anything serious. What made Emma special wasn't just her dedication to teaching, but her genuine involvement in the community. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, and sang in the church choir with a voice that could bring tears to the eyes of even the most stoic congregation members. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, brought soup to sick neighbors, and never missed a high school football game where she cheered enthusiastically for her former students who had grown up and graduated. On the evening of October 14, 2003, Emma had stayed late at school to prepare for the next day's lesson about autumn leaves, carefully cutting out paper shapes and organizing craft supplies for an art project that would help her students understand the science behind changing seasons. She left the school building at approximately 7:30 p.m., waving goodbye to the janitor Fred Martinez, who had worked at the school for 15 years and always made a point of ensuring that teachers got safely to their cars after dark. Emma stopped at Patterson's grocery store on her way home, purchasing ingredients for the chocolate chip cookies she planned to bake for her students as a Friday treat. The store's security camera captured her at 8, smiling and chatting with cashier Susan Chen about the upcoming weekend and her plans to visit her parents for Sunday dinner. She appeared relaxed and happy, showing no signs of concern or awareness that anything might be wrong. The last confirmed sighting of Emma Walsh was at 8:47 p.m., when her neighbor, elderly Mrs. Rose Kowalski, saw her climbing the external stairs to her apartment above the bakery. Miss Kowalski, who had insomnia and often watched the street from her bedroom window, noticed that Emma was carrying a bag of groceries and seemed to be humming to herself as she unlocked her door. The light in Emma's apartment came on at 8:50 p.m. and remained on until approximately 11:30 p.m., when Miss Kowalski finally fell asleep. What happened between 11:30 p.m. on October 14th and 6:00 a.m. on October 15th would remain a mystery for 20 years. But the evidence suggests that Emma's disappearance was not spontaneous or random. Someone had been watching her, learning her routine, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The fact that she vanished from her own apartment, a space where she should have been safe, made her disappearance even more terrifying for the residents of Millfield. When Emma failed to show up for work on October 5th, Principal Fisher knew immediately that something was seriously wrong. Emma had never missed a day of school without calling, and she was scheduled to lead the morning assembly that day, an event she had been planning for weeks. When Emma was 30 minutes late and hadn't answered any phone calls, Fisher drove to her apartment and discovered that her car was still parked in its designated spot behind the building. The apartment door was unlocked, which was unusual for Emma, who was always careful about security. The interior showed no signs of struggle, but several details immediately caught the attention of the responding officers. Emma's purse was on the kitchen counter with her wallet, keys and identification still inside her coat was hanging in the closet. Her lesson plans for the day were spread out on the dining room table, exactly as she would have left them while preparing for the next morning. Most puzzling was the discovery of Emma's cell phone, which was found on her nightstand, fully charged and showing no unusual calls or text messages. Her bed appeared to have been slept in, with the covers turned back on one side, but there was no way to determine if Emma had been the one sleeping there, or if someone else had disturbed the bedding. The only item that seemed out of place was a single red rose lying on the kitchen counter, its stem freshly cut and its petals still moist with what appeared to be morning dew. The initial investigation was led by Detective Raymond Ray Sullivan, a 20-year veteran of the Pennsylvania State Police who had recently been assigned to the Millfield area. Sullivan was experienced in missing persons cases, but Emma's disappearance presented unique challenges that would test every skill he had developed during his career. The lack of evidence suggesting struggle or forced entry meant that Emma might have left voluntarily, but everyone who knew her insisted that she would never abandon her students, her responsibilities without explanation. Sullivan's first priority was establishing a timeline of Emma's final days and identifying anyone who might have had reason to harm her. The investigation revealed that Emma had been receiving anonymous letters for several weeks before her disappearance, notes that expressed romantic interest, but were signed only with the initial M. Emma had mentioned these letters to her friend and fellow teacher Sarah Martinez, describing them as sweet but a little intense, and wondering if they might be from Michael Brennan, though she had never asked him directly. The letters, which were found in Emma's apartment, were written in careful block printing on plain white paper and contained detailed observations about Emma's daily routine that suggested the writer had been watching her for an extended period. One letter mentioned her Saturday morning visits to the animal shelter, another described the blue dress she had worn to church the previous Sunday, and a third referenced her habit of staying late at school to prepare lessons. The tone of the letters was affectionate but possessive, with phrases like "I watch over you" and "you belong with someone who truly understands you." Detective Sullivan immediately focused on Michael Brennan, the high school football coach who had dated Emma intermittently over the past 2 years. Brennan, 29 years old, and recently divorced, had been persistent in pursuing a more serious relationship with Emma, though she had been reluctant to commit to anything beyond casual dating. Several witnesses reported that Brennan had seemed jealous of Emma's dedication to her work and had made comments about her needing to make time for the important things in life. The investigation into Brennan revealed that he had a solid alibi for the night of Emma's disappearance. He had been at a coaching conference in Harrisburg from October with dozens of witnesses who could confirm his presence at various sessions and social events. The conference hotel's security cameras and phone records supported his claim that he had never left the premises during the crucial time period when Emma vanished. James Patterson, the veterinarian who had also dated Emma, became the next focus of Sullivan's investigation. Patterson was a quiet, introspective man who had moved to Millfield 3 years earlier to take over the practice of the retiring doctor. William Chen, his relationship with Emma had been brief but intense, ending when Emma decided she wasn't ready for the kind of commitment that Patterson was seeking. The breakup had been amicable, according to both parties, but Patterson had reportedly been disappointed and had hoped they might reconcile. Patterson's alibi was less solid than Brennan's. He claimed to have been at home on the night of October, reading veterinary journals and preparing for surgery scheduled for the following morning. His phone records showed no outgoing calls, and none of his neighbors could confirm seeing him that evening. However, a review of his patient files revealed that he had indeed performed the scheduled surgery on October 15th. beginning at 7:07 a.m., which would have made it difficult for him to have been involved in Emma's disappearance. As the investigation expanded, Detective Sullivan discovered that Emma had been more concerned about the anonymous letters than she had initially let on, according to her friend Sarah Martina. Emma had mentioned feeling watched during the weeks before her disappearance. She had noticed the same car parked near the school on several occasions, and had seen a figure standing across the street from her apartment late at night. When she questioned these observations, the person or vehicle would disappear, making her wonder if she was being paranoid. The car that Emma had noticed was described as a dark blue or black sedan, possibly a Ford or Chevrolet from the late 1990s. Several residents of Millfield reported seeing a similar vehicle in various locations around town during the weeks preceding Emma's disappearance, but nobody had been able to get a clear look at the driver or record a license plate number. The sightings seemed to follow a pattern that matched Emma's routine, appearing near the school during afternoon dismissal, parked outside the grocery store when she typically shopped, and cruising slowly past her apartment building during evening hours. What investigators didn't know at the time was that the person driving that dark sedan had been planning Emma's abduction for months, studying her habits with the patience of a predator who understood that success required perfect timing. The anonymous letters were just one part of an elaborate psychological campaign designed to make Emma feel special and wanted, before the final phase of the plan was implemented. But the identity of this stalker would remain hidden for 2 decades, protected by careful planning and sheer luck. The massive search effort that began on October 16 involved nearly 200 volunteers from Millfield and surrounding communities, including Emma's current and former students, their parents, and teachers from schools throughout the region. Search teams combed through forests, fields, and abandoned buildings within a 20-mile radius of town, while divers explored local ponds and streams. The Pennsylvania State Police brought in helicopters and search dogs, but despite the exhaustive effort, no trace of Emma was found. The search revealed just how deeply Emma had touched the lives of people throughout the region. Former students, some now in their 20s, took time off from work and college to join the effort. Parents who had never met Emma personally, but had heard their children speak of her with devotion, spent their weekends walking through dense woods and calling her name. The high school football team, coached by Michael Brent, suspended practice for a week so players could participate in the search. Detective Sullivan coordinated the search efforts from a command post established at the school, using maps and grids to ensure that every possible location was thoroughly examined. Volunteers were organized into teams of 6, each led by an experienced searcher, and equipped with walkie-talkies and GPS devices to maintain communication and prevent anyone from getting lost. The search area expanded daily as initial zones yielded no result, eventually covering over 300 square miles of rural Pennsylvania countryside. As days turned into weeks without any significant lead, the investigation began to focus on the possibility that Emma's disappearance was connected to a broader pattern of crimes. Detective Sullivan contacted law enforcement agencies throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, looking for similar cases involving missing women, but no clear connections emerged. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a profile of the likely perpetrator, describing him as an organized offender with local knowledge, who had probably been watching Emma for an extended period. The psychological profile suggested that Emma's abductor was likely a white male between 25 and 45 years old, employed in a position that allowed him flexibility in his schedule, and possibly known to Emma in some capacity. The profilers noted that the lack of evidence at the crime scene and careful planning evident in the anonymous letters indicated someone with above-average intelligence who had taken steps to avoid detection. They also suggested that the perpetrator might attempt to insert himself into the investigation or search efforts, a common behavior among organized offenders. This prediction proved to be eerily accurate, as investigators would later discover that Emma's killer had indeed participated in the search efforts, joining volunteer teams and even offering suggestions about areas that should be searched more thoroughly. He had walked alongside Emma's friends and family, expressing sympathy for their loss, while knowing exactly where she could be found. His ability to maintain this facade for weeks demonstrated a level of psychological compartmentalization that would serve him well in the years to come. As 2003, the active investigation into Emma's disappearance gradually wound down. Though Detective Sullivan never officially closed the case, the lack of physical evidence, the absence of credible witnesses, and the failure to identify a viable suspect meant that Emma's fate remained unknown. Her parents, David and Margaret Walsh, struggled to maintain hope while dealing with the devastating uncertainty of not knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead. The Walsh family's ordeal was compounded by well-meaning but misguided efforts from psychics. amateur investigators, and conspiracy theorists who contacted them with theories about Emma's disappearance. Some claimed to have visions of her location, others suggested elaborate kidnapping schemes involving human trafficking, and still others proposed that Emma had voluntarily disappeared to start a new life elsewhere. Each of these contacts reopened wounds that were trying to heal and forced the family to confront the possibility that they might never know the truth. Margaret Walsh, Emma's mother, became obsessed with maintaining Emma's memory and keeping public attention focused on her case. She organized annual memorial services, created a scholarship fund in Emma's name, and regularly contacted media outlets to ensure that her daughter's disappearance wasn't forgotten. David Walsh, meanwhile, struggled with anger and helplessness, often driving aimlessly through the countryside looking for any sign of his daughter or clues that investigators might have missed. The first red rose appeared on October 5th. Exactly 1 year after Emma's disappearance, Margaret Walsh discovered it when she opened the front door of 412 Maple Street to retrieve the morning newspaper. The single crimson bloom lay on the welcome mat, accompanied by a handwritten note that read, "For Emma, never forgotten," in the same careful block printing that had characterized the anonymous letters Emma had received before her disappearance. Margaret's hands trembled as she called Detective Sullivan to report the discovery, hope and terror warring in her voice as she described finding the rose. The detective arrived within 30 minutes, carefully photographing the flower and note before sending them to the state crime lab for analysis. The handwriting was indeed consistent with the letters found in Emma's apartment, suggesting that whoever had written to her was still in the area and still thinking about her. The laboratory analysis of the rose and note provided tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. Fingerprint examination revealed only smudged partial prints that were too damaged to be useful. Identification DNA testing in 2004 was not sophisticated enough to extract usable genetic material from the small traces of skin cells that might have been present on the paper or flower stem. The ink used for the note was a common ballpoint pen variety available at any office supply. Detective Sullivan attempted to establish surveillance around the Walsh home in anticipation of the second anniversary of Emma's disappearance. But the logistics of watching the house continuously for several days proved challenging with the limited resources available to his department. Surveillance operation was hampered by the need to remain unobtrusive in a small town where unusual activity would be quickly noticed and reported. The second rose arrived precisely on schedule, October 5th, delivered during the same early morning window when the street was deserted. Despite the surveillance efforts, the person responsible managed to approach the house, leave the flower and disappear without being detected. The note was identical to the previous year's message, written in the careful block printing that had become hauntingly familiar to the Walsh family. The annual rose delivery developed a psychological impact that extended far beyond the immediate Walsh family. Residents of Millfield began to view October 15th with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Knowing that the mysterious flower would appear and wondering what it meant about Emma's fate, some residents installed security cameras in the hope of capturing images of the person responsible, while others made a point of being outside during the early morning hour, hoping to spot suspicious activity. Detective Sullivan's investigation into the rose deliveries focused on identifying patterns that might reveal the perpetrator's identity. He analyzed the timing of the deliveries, the route the person must have taken to approach the house undetected, and the physical characteristics that would be required to carry out the task. The roses themselves were examined for any distinguishing features that might indicate their source, but they appeared to be standard red roses available from any florist or garden center. As years passed, the roses took on an almost ritualistic significance for the entire town of Millfield. Residents would mark the anniversary of Emma's disappearance by watching for the mysterious flower delivery, and some began leaving their own flowers and notes at the Walsh family home in a gesture of solidarity and remembrance. The October 15th memorial became an unofficial town holiday, with many businesses closing early and the school holding a special assembly in Emma's honor. The investigation into Emma's disappearance had revealed several disturbing undercurrents in what had appeared to be an idyllic small town. Detective Sullivan discovered that Millfield, like many rural communities, harbored secrets and tensions that were carefully hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. Several residents had histories of domestic violence, substance abuse, or financial problems that had never been publicly acknowledged. One particularly troubling discovery involved Marcus Wellington, a maintenance worker who had been employed by the school district since 2001. Wellington had access to all school buildings and had keys to virtually every room on campus. His background check had revealed no criminal history, but several co-workers described him as strange and antisocial, someone who preferred to work alone and rarely participated in casual conversations. Wellington had been interviewed during the initial investigation, but his responses had been cooperative, and his alibi for the night of Emma's disappearance seemed solid. He claimed to have been at home watching television, and while no one could corroborate this story, there was no evidence to contradict it either. Wellington's personnel file contained glowing reviews from supervisors, who praised his reliability and work ethic, noting that he was always punctual and rarely took sick days. What investigators didn't know at the time was that Wellington's reliability stemmed partly from his obsessive personality and need for control. He had developed elaborate routines for every aspect of his work and personal life, and deviation from these patterns caused him significant anxiety. Emma's presence at the school had become part of his daily routine, and her friendly greetings and occasional requests for maintenance assistance had triggered fantasies that gradually consumed more and more of his thoughts. Wellington's obsession with Emma had begun innocently enough, sparked by her kindness and genuine appreciation for his work. Unlike many teachers who barely acknowledged his presence, Emma always thanked him personally when he fixed problems in her classroom, and sometimes asked about his family or weekend plans. These interactions, while perfectly normal and professional, became the foundation for Wellington's elaborate romantic fantasies. The maintenance worker began timing his work schedule to coincide with Emma's presence at the school, finding excuses to clean the hallways near her classroom or repair equipment that didn't actually need attention. He learned her daily routine with obsessive precision, noting when she arrived each morning, what time she took her lunch break, and how late she typically stayed after school. Wellington's knowledge of the building's layout and security systems gave him unprecedented access to Emma's daily life. The anonymous letters that Emma had received were Wellington's attempt to gauge her romantic interest without revealing his identity. He had spent weeks crafting each message, choosing words that he hoped would intrigue her, while providing enough personal details to demonstrate his intimate knowledge of her life. The letters were part of an elaborate courtship ritual that existed entirely in Wellington's imagination, with Emma as an unwilling and unknowing participant. When Emma failed to respond to the letters with the enthusiasm Wellington had expected, his fantasy relationship began to take on darker tones. He interpreted her polite but distant behavior toward him as evidence that she was being influenced by others who didn't understand their connection. Wellington's mental state deteriorated as his obsession intensified, and he began to believe that drastic action was necessary to protect their relationship from outside interference. The careful planning that went into Emma's abduction reflected Wellington's methodical personality and his intimate knowledge of both her routine and the school's security systems. He had studied her apartment building during off hours, noting the location of her unit, the external staircase that provided access, and the typical patterns of activity among her neighbors. Wellington had even obtained a copy of her apartment key by following her to a locksmith, and claiming to be her boyfriend who needed a spare key made. On the night of October 14, 2000, entering Emma's apartment through the back door while she slept, he had brought chloroform and rope, intending to subdue her quietly and transport her to a remote cabin he had prepared in the mountains where they could begin their life together away from the interfering influences of family and friends. But Emma wakened during the intrusion and struggled more violently than Wellington had anticipated. The struggle that followed was brief, but violent, ending when Emma fell and struck her head on the corner of her coffee table. The injury was fatal, and Wellington found himself standing over the body of the woman he claimed to love, his elaborate fantasies shattered by the reality of what he had done in his panic. Wellington's training and experience as a maintenance worker took over, and he began to methodically clean the crime scene and dispose of evidence. Wellington wrapped Emma's body in a tarp and loaded it into the school district's maintenance truck, which he had borrowed under the pretense of conducting emergency repairs. The remote burial site he had chosen was located on state forest land approximately 40 miles from Millfield, in an area where he had previously disposed of yard waste and construction debris. The location was isolated enough to ensure that the burial would not be discovered, but accessible enough that Wellington could visit periodically. The psychological aftermath of Emma's murder created a complex emotional state for Wellington that would persist for the next 20 years. Part of him was horrified by what he had done and genuinely mourned Emma's death, while another part continued to maintain the fantasy that their relationship had been real and meaningful. The annual rose deliveries were his way of honoring this imaginary relationship, while simultaneously taunting the community that had failed to protect Emma. Wellington's ability to continue working at the school and interacting with Emma's colleagues and students required a level of psychological compartmentalization that was both impressive and terrifying. He attended Emma's memorial services, participated in fundraising efforts for the scholarship established in her name, even volunteered for search efforts, all while knowing exactly where her body was buried. His apparent genuine emotion during these events was actually mourning for the relationship he had created in his mind. As years passed, Wellington's guilt and paranoia increased, but his need to maintain the connection to Emma through the annual roses remained constant. He developed elaborate rituals around the flower deliveries, purchasing the roses from different florists each year, and taking circuitous routes to the Walsh home to avoid establishing patterns that might be detected by surveillance. Each delivery required careful planning and timing to ensure that he wouldn't be seen or caught. The stress of maintaining his secret for 20 years took a significant toll on Wellington's mental and physical health. He developed insomnia, anxiety, and depression, but was afraid to seek professional help for fear that he might accidentally reveal information about Emma's death. His work performance remained exemplary, partly because his job provided the structure and routine that helped him maintain his psychological equilibrium. Detective Sullivan retired in 2015, passing Emma's case file to Detective Lisa Rodriguez, a younger investigator with experience in cold cases and advanced forensic techniques. Rodriguez brought fresh eyes to the investigation, utilizing new technologies and databases that hadn't been available to Sullivan during the initial years of the case. She was particularly interested in the DNA evidence that had been collected from the original crime scene and the annual rose deliveries. Rodriguez's approach to the case differed significantly from her predecessor's methodology. While Sullivan had focused primarily on traditional investigative techniques such as witness interviews and background checks, Rodriguez embraced the emerging field of genetic genealogy and advanced forensic analysis. She recognized that the key to solving Emma's case lay in the biological evidence that had been carefully preserved for nearly 2 decades. The breakthrough that would finally solve Emma's case came in when Detective Rodriguez submitted the DNA evidence to a private genealogy laboratory that specialized in using genetic genealogy to identify suspects in cold cases. The process involved uploading the unknown DNA profile to public databases containing genetic information from millions of people who had submitted samples for ancestry research. The analysis required several months of careful work by genealogists who constructed family trees based on genetic similarities. The genetic genealogy analysis identified several potential familial matches, leading Rodriguez to construct family trees that eventually pointed to a specific individual who had been living in Millfield during the time of Emma's disappearance. The process was complex and time-consuming, requiring Rodriguez to verify genealogical connections through birth certificate, marriage records, and other official documents, while eliminating potential suspects who couldn't have been responsible for the crime. Marcus Wellington emerged as the primary suspect when the genealogical analysis indicated that he was a close genetic match to the DNA evidence recovered from Emma's apartment and the annual roses. Wellington had been interviewed briefly during the initial investigation, as part of the routine questioning of school employees, but he had provided a seemingly solid alibi and had never emerged as a serious suspect. His personnel file revealed a quiet, reliable employee with no history of disciplinary problems or complaints from coworkers. When Detective Rodriguez began investigating Wellington's background more thoroughly, she discovered several red flags that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Wellington's employment history showed a pattern of jobs that provided access to buildings and women, including previous positions as a security guard and apartment maintenance worker. He had no close friends or romantic relationships, and his lifestyle was remarkably solitary for someone living in a small town. The financial records that Rodriguez obtained through court order revealed Wellington had been making regular purchases of red roses from various florists throughout central Pennsylvania for the past 20 years. The purchases always occurred in early October, and the quantities were consistent with the single roses that had been delivered to the Walsh home. Wellington had paid cash for these purchases, apparently in an attempt to avoid creating a paper trail. Surveillance of Wellington began in September 2023, with Rodriguez and her team documenting daily routines and watching for any behavior that might indicate he was planning to deliver another rose on the upcoming anniversary of Emma's disappearance. The surveillance revealed a man whose life had become increasingly dominated by anxiety and paranoia. Wellington appeared to be constantly looking over his shoulder and frequently changed his routines in ways that suggested he might be aware that he was being watched. The confrontation between Detective Rodriguez and Marcus Wellington took place on October 10, 2023, 5 days before the 20th anniversary of Emma's disappearance. Rodriguez approached Wellington at his home with a search warrant, and a team of forensic technicians prepared to collect evidence that would either confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. The DNA sample that Rodriguez obtained from Wellington would be compared to the evidence collected from Emma's apartment and the roses. Wellington's initial reaction to the search was calm and cooperative, but Rodriguez noticed signs of stress that became more pronounced as the investigation progressed. His hands shook when he signed consent forms. His voice trembled when he answered questions, and his eyes darted constantly toward the door as if he was calculating his chances of escape. When Rodriguez mentioned Emma's name, Wellington's composure finally cracked. The laboratory analysis that confirmed Wellington's DNA match to the evidence from Emma's case took 3 days, during which Rodriguez continued her investigation into Wellington's activities during the 20 years since Emma's disappearance. The DNA results showed a probability of over 99.9% that Wellington was the source of the biological evidence found in Emma's apartment, finally providing the definitive proof that had eluded investigators for 2 decades. When Detective Rodriguez confronted Wellington with the DNA evidence on October 13, 2023, his carefully constructed facade finally collapsed after 20 years of maintaining his innocence and living with the secret of what he had done to Emma Walsh. Wellington confessed to her kidnapping, murder in a detailed statement that revealed the depth of his obsession and the careful planning that had gone into her disappearance. Wellington's confession was both relieving and horrifying for the investigators, who had worked on Emma's case for so many years. The relief came from finally having answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. But the horror came from understanding how close Wellington had been to being caught on numerous occasions, and how his position of trust within the school system had allowed him to operate undetected. The detailed confession that Wellington provided filled in the gaps that had puzzled investigators for 20 years. He described his growing obsession with Emma, the planning that had gone into her abduction, the struggle that had resulted in her death, and the elaborate measures he had taken to dispose of her body and cover his tracks. Wellington also explained the psychological motivation behind the annual rose deliveries, describing them as his way of maintaining a connection to Emma and honoring their relationship. Wellington led investigators to Emma's burial site on October 20, 2023. A week after his confession, the remote location in the state forest was exactly as he had described it, with Emma's remains buried beneath several feet of earth and covered with rocks and debris to prevent discovery by animals or casual hikers. The recovery operation required several days of careful excavation by forensic anthropologists, who worked to preserve every piece of evidence. The recovery of Emma's remains finally provided the closure that her family had sought for 20 years. Margaret and David Walsh, now elderly and frail, were present when their daughter's body was finally brought home. The emotional impact of this moment was overwhelming for everyone involved, as 20 years of uncertainty and anguish were finally replaced by the concrete reality of Emma's death, and the knowledge that her killer had been brought to justice. The forensic examination of Emma's remains confirmed the details of Wellington's confession, while also providing additional evidence about the circumstances of death. The injuries to her skull were consistent with the impact Wellington had described, and trace evidence found with the remains linked back to materials that had been in Wellington's possession. The examination also revealed that Emma had been buried with several personal items that Wellington had taken from her apartment. The trial of Marcus Wellington took place in the spring of 2024, with the defendant pleading guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was packed with Emma's former students, now adults with children of their own, who had never forgotten their beloved teacher and the profound impact she had made on their lives during her brief time at Millfield Elementary School. The victim impact statements that were read during Wellington's sentencing hearing provided a powerful testament to Emma's lasting influence on the community. Former students spoke about how Emma had inspired them to pursue careers in education, while parents described the comfort they had found in knowing that their children were being taught by someone who genuinely cared about their welfare. Colleagues from the school district spoke about the void that Emma's death had created, and their relief that her killer had finally been brought to justice. Margaret Walsh's statement was particularly moving, as she described 20 years of wondering what had happened to her daughter and the emotional toll of receiving anonymous roses every year on the anniversary of Emma's disappearance. She thanked Detective Rodriguez and the forensic specialists who had finally solved the case, while also expressing forgiveness for Wellington in hopes that his confession would allow him to find some measure of peace. The resolution of Emma's case brought a mixture of relief and sorrow to the town of Millfield. Relief that her killer had finally been brought to justice, but sorrow that 21 years had been lost that could never be recovered. Emma's parents, now elderly and frail, expressed gratitude that they had lived long enough to see justice served, though they acknowledged that no punishment could truly compensate for the loss of their daughter and the decades of uncertainty they had endured. Detective Rodriguez's successful use of genetic genealogy to solve Emma's case led to renewed efforts to resolve other cold cases in Pennsylvania, with several additional investigations yielding arrests and convictions. The technology that had finally identified Wellington represented a revolution in forensic science, providing hope to families who had given up believing that their loved ones' cases would ever be solved. The story of Emma Walsh became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can exist in even the safest communities, reminding residents that predators often hide in plain sight, masquerading as trustworthy members of society. While harboring dark secrets, Marcus Wellington had worked alongside Emma's colleagues for years, attending the same community events and expressing sympathy for her family's loss, all while knowing exactly what had happened to her. The final red rose was delivered to 412 Maple Street on October 15, 2023, just days before Wellington's arrest. This time, however, the flower carried additional evidence that helped investigators confirm his identity and build their case against him. The DNA evidence recovered from the rose petals matched samples taken from Wellington's home, providing the final piece of the puzzle that had frustrated investigators for 2 decades. Emma Catherine Walsh was finally laid to rest on December 3rd, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched during her 25 years. The funeral service was held at First Baptist Church, where Emma had sung in the choir, and her former students served as pallbearers, carrying their beloved teacher to her final resting place with the love and respect she had always deserved. The legacy of Emma's case extends far beyond the resolution of a single crime. Her story has inspired new protocols for school security, enhanced training for educators about recognizing potential threats, and increased awareness about the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. The Emma Walsh Foundation, established by her family, provides scholarships for aspiring teachers and funds programs designed to improve school safety and security. As Millfield slowly healed from the trauma of Emma's disappearance and the shocking revelation of her killer's identity, residents began to remember her not as a victim, but as the dedicated teacher and caring community member she had always been. The red roses that had once symbolized mystery and fear became, in retrospect, a twisted monument to obsession that helped investigators finally bring a killer to justice. The case of Emma Walsh serves as a reminder that time and technology can eventually unmask even the most carefully hidden secrets, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through persistence, dedication, and the advancing science of criminal investigation. Her story continues to inspire investigators working on cold cases throughout the country, proving that no case is ever truly hopeless, as long as someone refuses to give up the search for truth. And so the mystery that had haunted Millfield for 20 years finally came to an end. Not with the dramatic confrontation that fiction might suggest, but with the quiet satisfaction of scientific evidence and careful police work. The red roses that had appeared like clockwork every October 15th would never come again. But Emma Walsh's memory would live on in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the lives of the countless students she had inspired during her brief but meaningful career as an educator. The town of Millfield would never completely recover from the revelation that one of their own had been responsible for Emma's death, but they found comfort in knowing that justice had finally been served and that Emma's story would continue to make a difference in the lives of others. The red roses that had terrorized the Walsh family for 20 years became evidence in the prosecution's case, each preserved petal containing traces of DNA that would ultimately seal Wellington's fate. In the months following Wellington's conviction, the school district implemented comprehensive security reforms that included background checks for all employees, enhanced surveillance systems, and mandatory training programs designed to help staff identify potentially dangerous behavior patterns. Emma's case had exposed critical vulnerabilities in the system that protected children and teachers, vulnerabilities that had allowed a predator to operate undetected for years while having access to potential victims. The psychological impact of Wellington's arrest rippled through the community in unexpected ways. Several residents came forward with stories about uncomfortable interactions they had experienced with Wellington over the years. Encounters that had seemed merely awkward at the time, but took on sinister significance in light of his confession. Parents who had trusted their children to the care of the school system grappled with the horrifying realization that the person responsible for maintaining safe learning environments had been the very threat they had been trying to protect their children from. Detective Rodriguez continued to work on cold cases throughout Pennsylvania, using the techniques that had successfully solved Emma's murder to bring closure to other families who had been waiting decades for answers. The genetic genealogy methods that had identified Wellington were applied to dozens of unsolved cases, resulting in several additional arrests and convictions that demonstrated the revolutionary power of combining traditional detective work with cutting-edge forensic science. Margaret Walsh lived to see her daughter's killer brought to justice, but she passed away peacefully in her sleep just 6 months after Wellington's sentencing. Finally able to rest knowing that Emma's murderer would never harm another person, her funeral was attended by many of the same people who had gathered to remember Emma, creating a sense of completion for a tragedy that had defined 2 decades of their lives. David Walsh, now alone but no longer tormented by unanswered questions, found solace in the knowledge that their ordeal had led to advances in criminal investigation that would help solve other cases and prevent similar tragedies. The Emma Walsh Foundation continued to grow and expand its mission, providing not only scholarships for aspiring teachers but also funding for research into improved security measures for schools and communities. The foundation's annual gala became one of the most important social events in central Pennsylvania, attracting educators, law enforcement officials, and families affected by violent crime who gathered to honor Emma's memory and support efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Marcus Wellington died in prison in 2020, reportedly from complications related to a heart condition that had worsened during his incarceration. His death eliminated any possibility of appeals or additional revelations about other potential victims. But investigators had already determined that Emma was likely his only victim. Psychological evaluation conducted during his trial had concluded that his obsession had been specifically focused on Emma rather than part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior. The case files from Emma's investigation became part of a training curriculum used by law enforcement agents throughout the United States, serving as an example of how modern forensic techniques could be applied to seemingly impossible cold cases. Detective academies and FBI training programs studied the methodologies that had led to Wellington's identification, ensuring that future investigators would be equipped with the knowledge and tools necessary to solve similar crimes. As the years passed and the immediate trauma of Emma's case began to fade, the town of Millfield gradually returned to its quiet routine, but with a deeper understanding of the hidden dangers that could lurk beneath the surface of even the most peaceful communities. The annual October 15th memorial services continued, but they evolved from somber reminders of an unsolved mystery into celebrations of Emma's life and legacy, honoring her contributions to education and her lasting impact on the students whose lives she had touched during her brief but meaningful career. The red roses that had once symbolized fear and uncertainty were replaced by white lilies at Emma's graveside, flowers chosen by her former students who wanted to create new associations with beauty and remembrance rather than the dark obsession that had claimed her life. The transformation from mystery to resolution, from terror to justice, represented the community's determination to reclaim Emma's story and ensure that she would be remembered for the joy she had brought to so many lives, rather than the circumstances of her death. And in the end, the 20-year mystery of the red roses had served its purpose in the most unexpected way possible, providing the very evidence that would finally bring Emma's killer to justice and allow her family, friends, and community to find the peace that had eluded them for far too long.